Felicitations to you all. Welcome to our 5th online talk in our series of inspirational stories from the home of the mother of Methodism herself, Susanna Wesley. Currently, I am downstairs out of my office in the fore kitchen, which has far better Wi-Fi reception than my office. You'll be glad to hear. As you can also see, we've had a major tidy up for the occasion, because over the past few weeks, we've all been extremely busy preparing the house to welcome visitors back to the museum and putting the finishing touches to this year's exhibition, which celebrates Mahmoud's 10th birthday. Today, into our forum, we welcome Professor William Gibson, who, apart from being one of the Rectory's trustees, is, in his day job, the Professor of Ecclesiastical History and Director of the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History at Oxford Brookes University. Bill has written extensively on 18th and 19th century religion, his history, politics, dissent and evangelical revivalism, and has recently written a new book on Samuel Wesley and the crisis of Tory piety, 1685 to 1720. And I have a copy here. Thank you, Bill. Bill is also the current editor of the Journal of Religious History, Literature and Culture. In this afternoon's talk, Bill is to give us all an appraisal of Samuel Wesley's life here in Epworth on this most pertinent of days. Over our previous meetings together, there has been a focus on Susanna's theology and teaching. Now Bill is to put the record straight and to tell us more about Samuel, his theology and his personal influence upon his son. As we're about to start, Owen has put us already on mute. So now we're ready. Please, let's get started. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks very much indeed, Jill. That's a very kind introduction. As you appreciate in these talks, Susanna has been very much to the fore. But as Jill hints, really, yes, my purpose is to put some of Samuel back into our account of what Susanna's life was. And it's important, I think, to say that Samuel was probably the most significant person in Susanna's life. Now, at this point, I'm going to begin my PowerPoint, so I'm going to follow the instructions that Owen gave me earlier and share the screen. And this, I hope everybody can see, is one of the traditional portraits, or thought to be a portrait, of Samuel Wesley. It's only ascribed to be Samuel because it's on the frontispiece of his translation of the Book of Job, and people, I think, have made an assumption this is Samuel Wesley. At the end of the talk, I'll introduce a newer discovery of a portrait of Samuel, which is the one on the front cover of my book. But it's perhaps important to start with what a TV producer would call Samuel's backstory. Where did he come from, and what do we know about him before he went to Epworth? Well, he was born in 1662. This was his father, Samuel Wesley, with a T. Samuel Wesley had been the Puritan rector of Winterbourne Whitchurch in Dorset. But when the church was restored in 1660, when the monarchy came back, a Puritan such as John Wesley simply couldn't tolerate returning to the Church of England or becoming part of the Church of England with all that implied. And therefore, John Wesley abandoned his parish, or was rather ejected from his parish, and a new vicar was appointed, new rector was appointed. John Wesley, however, refused to give up his ministry, even though it was illegal. There are a series of laws which were passed in the 1660s to outlaw Puritan clergy, such as John Wesley. And as a result of that, John Wesley was repeatedly imprisoned for carrying out illegal ministry. And in fact, he died in 1678 when Samuel was 16. He was clearly exhausted by his battle with the church authorities and with the state. Samuel was educated at a number of dissenting academies in London, and he was paid for from collections from wealthy dissenters. It's important to emphasize that dissenting academies were sort of part school, part college, really. They straddled the idea of school and college, and were often intended to be training grounds for future dissenting ministers. Paradoxically, it's in a dissenting academy that Samuel found himself moving away from dissent, because he said he found the other students vulgar and profane. In 1684, it was suggested to Samuel that he ought to think about going to the University of Oxford. Now, technically, Oxford was only open to members of the Church of England, but Samuel may have thought that there was a chance in the coming reign of James II that James would open the universities to Anglicans, to dissenters as well as Catholics. He may also have thought that conforming to the Church of England and getting a university degree would be good for his career. So in 1685, he went to Oxford, he became a member of Exeter College, and he conformed to the Church of England while he was there. Oxford in the 1680s was a very Tory university indeed. It was the university which only 5 years before had proclaimed that its official position was that rebellion against the king was a heresy and was a sin. And Samuel seems to have absorbed all of these very strong Tory monarchical principles, and he undoubtedly became very committed to James II. In fact, he was one of the students at Oxford who contributed to this publication, Strenae Natalitii, in 1688. This was a group of Oxford academics and students put this publication together as poetry welcoming the birth of the son of James II, Prince James Francis Edward, in the summer of 1688. So Samuel has this pretty strong commitment to James and to the Catholic monarchy which he is presiding over. During his time at Oxford, we know that he met Susanna Annesley, and of course they were married in mid-November 1688. Samuel was 26 and Susanna was 19. Now, the timing of their marriage is curious. It certainly doesn't conform to the usual pattern of marriages in the late 17th century. First, Samuel had no income. He'd been ordained as a deacon, but he wasn't yet in priest's orders. He had no place to live and had no parish, clearly. And in fact, immediately after their marriage, he went off to sea to be a ship's chaplain. The other possible explanation for a hasty marriage was that the woman might be pregnant, but it's clear that that wasn't the case because Susanna's first child wasn't born until January 1691. It's equally clear, and another possible explanation for hasty marriage was that they wanted to get out from under their parents' hooves, so to speak, but that wasn't the case either, because after their marriage, they lived for a few weeks, or in fact a few months, with Susanna's parents. So the marriage in the middle of November 1688 is really quite extraordinary. Why did they marry then? Well, my speculation is that they married because 2 weeks earlier, William of Orange had invaded in Torbay, and since they were both committed to James II, possibly they wanted to be married under his reign rather than during a period of civil war as they expected, or possibly when a usurper had taken the throne. Now, that probably sounds quite an odd idea to the 21st century ear, the idea that you choose to be married on the basis of political circumstances. But as we'll see, Susanna and Samuel and many other marriages in this period were heavily political. So Samuel and Susanna married, and soon afterwards, Samuel was ordained. And as I say, he went off to sea as a ship's chaplain. Before he did this, indeed at his ordination, he abandoned James II and swore the oath of loyalty to the new King and Queen, William and Mary. Now, most Anglican clergy did this, and they did it on the basis that James, by fleeing the country, had abandoned the throne and had effectively abdicated. And that meant any oaths of allegiance that had been sworn to him had dissolved. But it seems to me that there was probably quite a lot of soul searching on Samuel's part, as there was on the part of many other Anglican clergy. One of the things that's remarkable about Samuel, indeed, I suspect probably in this period, possibly unique, was that when he was ordained deacon in September 1688, he swore the oaths of allegiance to James II. When he was ordained priest early in 1689, he swore the oaths of allegiance to William and Mary. So he lived this curious life in which he jumped a fence from support for James to support for William and Mary. But as we'll see, Susanna hadn't. So Samuel accepted the revolution of 1688. One aspect of the revolution that he found very uncomfortable, as we'll see, was the Toleration Act of 1689, which followed on from the revolution. And the Toleration Act allowed dissenters to worship freely, and in Epworth, this caused problems. But we're running ahead of ourselves. How did Samuel get to Epworth? Well, for the first few years of their married life, Samuel and Susanna were pretty poor. After he came back from his naval chaplaincy, he had a series of relatively poorly paid posts as a curate. And he really only made ends meet by writing for his brother-in-law's magazine, the Athenian Mercury. The Athenian Mercury was a curious magazine. It was partly a sort of contemporary issues magazine, but it had a large section in which people could write in and ask questions. And Samuel, besides writing religious articles, also dealt with the religious queries that people wrote in about. But writing was clearly important for Samuel. And in 1694, he published this, a lengthy work, The Life of Our Blessed Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, in 10 books. So it wasn't a small item. This wasn't easy reading by any means. This is a later edition, the 1697 edition. And very carefully, he dedicated it, as you can see, to Her Most Sacred Majesty. So he was dedicating his Life of Christ to Queen Mary. And he dedicated it to her very shortly before she died. Samuel Wesley later said that he was appointed to Epworth, which was in the Crown's gift, because the Queen had admired his poem. But it's possible that his appointment also owed something to the fact that the Queen's death occurred in 1694, and he published a detailed, again, another lengthy poem as an elegy to her on her death. So either way, either out of admiration or because of the elegy, Samuel was appointed to Epworth. It was a crown living with a sizable income. It yielded, in official records, it yielded about £200 a year, which if Samuel had extracted from his parishioners would have made him pretty comfortably off. But as many of you will know, Samuel was not good with money. Indeed, this is something of an understatement. He spent it terribly unwisely and was no good really at making it. One of the first decisions he made when he became rector of Epworth was to manage what was called the tithes and the glebe himself. Previously, the rectors of Epworth employed an agent who collected the tithes on their behalf and managed the glebe land of the parish and therefore kept a percentage. But Samuel thought he could probably do better than this and sacked the agent and decided to collect the tithes himself and farm the glebe land himself. And the result of that was that things went disastrously badly. And because he was such a poor manager of his money, Samuel probably only earned about £70 or £80 a year rather than the 200. And to give you an idea of the sort of debts that Samuel started to build up. Here's a list of the debts he had developed in 1705. He borrowed money to travel to London to pay for his induction. He had to buy farm equipment to farm the glebe of the parish. He had to rebuild the tithe barn. His mother was very poor and she had to be saved from imprisonment for debt. He had a first fruits payment, which was the tax you paid as a clergyman on your entry to a parish. There were tenths, which were your payments for the appointment. By tradition, Epworth paid £3 a year to the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. And then there were land taxes and poor rates, some money for his mother, and repayment of a loan from Bishop Burnet. So poor old Samuel had a small income. He wasn't able to extract the tithes and wasn't very good at farming the glebe, and therefore financially things were going pretty badly. Now, going back to their marriage, when Susanna and Samuel had been at Epworth for 6 years, and this is 12 years after the Revolution, of course, Susanna's Jacobitism was revealed because she refused to say Amen at family prayers when Samuel prayed for the king. And after a bit, in fact, Samuel must have been pretty unobservant, really, because he only noticed it after 6 years. But after 6 years, he spots this and says to Susanna, "Why don't you say Amen for the king?" And quite boldly, Susanna said to him, "I don't believe he's the lawful king. I still believe that James is the lawful king." And Samuel was absolutely furious about this, and they had a pretty full and frank exchange of views, at the end of which Samuel said, "If you and I have 2 kings, we must have 2 beds." In other words, he wouldn't sleep with her after she had announced that she was a Jacobite and didn't believe that William III was the lawful king. And in fact, Samuel left her and went off to London for between 8 and 9 months. Now, Methodist myth has it that Samuel went off to London because he had to go to attend meetings of convocation. But actually, that isn't the case. One of the pieces of research for my book was to track down exactly when Samuel was elected to convocation, and he wasn't elected for another 9 years. So he wasn't going off to London for convocation. He was going off because he had abandoned his wife. We know that he wasn't in London for any other purpose because Susanna herself said to Lady Yarborough that he was looking for a naval chaplaincy at the same time that he was in London. So he couldn't have been looking for a naval chaplaincy and trying to attend convocation. Susanna shared her worries about her husband with Lady Yarborough and eventually decided she would talk to a churchman about this, and she chose George Hicks. George Hicks was an interesting choice. George Hicks had been Dean of Worcester, but he'd been ejected from his deanery at the Revolution because, like Susanna, he refused to accept James was no longer king. So he became literally, as it's called, a non-juror, somebody who wouldn't take the oath to William and Mary. So it has to be said that Susanna is really stacking the cards here. She's asking somebody's opinion who she knows agrees with her politically. And indeed, she clearly expected George Hicks to say that she was in the right. In fact, while George Hicks said that she was right as far as accepting James as the lawful king, he told her that her duty was to submit to Samuel and that she should do it in the expectation that it would earn her salvation. In fact, he said that she should do it in the spirit that the first Christians under the Roman Empire accepted the rule of Rome, even though it wasn't a godly rule. So Samuel and Susanna's marriage was reconciled, and we know it was reconciled in the fullest way because they had 5 or 6 further pregnancies. Susanna was pregnant on 19 occasions in total. But nevertheless, of course, we know that their relationship remained fairly tense. Susanna, as everybody here I suspect will know, defied Samuel in holding prayer meetings in the rectory when he was away from Epworth. And people have often wondered why Samuel was so opposed to Susanna holding those prayer meetings. Well, the reason was that Samuel was off in London attending convocation, attacking dissenters for holding meetings at which the parson wasn't present. And here was Susanna in his own parish holding just such a meeting where the parson wasn't present. Indeed, the curate, Mr. Inman, who he had appointed in his absence, wasn't present either. So there was simmering tension throughout their marriage. And a year after the prayers controversy, Samuel, rather startlingly, reported his wife to the Bishop of Lincoln for, in his view, not being validly baptized. The bishop wrote and said, "Tell me the names of all the people you don't think are baptized in your parish." And Samuel wrote back, "Everybody in my parish is baptized except my wife." And he added, "who has none but Presbyterian baptism." In other words, she's only been baptized as a Presbyterian, so she hasn't really been baptized. Later in her life, Susanna wrote of her disappointments, and one of these was her husband. And yet, as she wrote, she said she would stay with him and be buried with him. In fact, of course, she wasn't. This is Samuel's on the left-hand side. This is Samuel's grave in Epworth Rectory churchyard, and on the right is Susanna's burial place in Bunhill Fields in London, in the dissenters' burial place. One aspect that I find extraordinary about Samuel and Susanna's relationship is the way in which Susanna addressed him and referred to him. Because I've read many of, well, both Susanna and Samuel's letters, and it's very, very rare that Susanna refers to Samuel as other than my master or Mr. Wesley. Even when she wrote to her children, she didn't write your father, she wrote my master or Mr. Wesley. And I think that suggests a degree of separation between them. Let me take wet my whistle. Samuel had a talent for falling out with people, and this badly affected his relations with his parishioners. He was appalled that there were 80 dissenting families in his parish, and he regarded dissenters as schismatics and sinful. He berated his parishioners for their immorality, and he prosecuted them in church courts as a means of disciplining them. And he also pursued dissenters through the church courts. By 1705, many of his parishioners began to withhold their tithes and tried to force him out of the parish by burning his crops and attacking his livestock. They may also have been responsible for one or more of the 3 fires that affected the rectory at this time. Samuel, in order to make up his money, got deeper into debt, and by 1705, he was, in modern equivalent terms, £40,000 in debt, a huge sum. In 1705, he made the terrible error of publicly changing his votes in the election of 1705. Previously, Samuel had made it, well, you voted publicly anyway, so everybody knew who he voted for. Previously, Samuel had always given one of his 2 votes in the county election to a Whig and one to a Tory. So he'd effectively split his vote. And that was quite common for clergy. In 1705, the election, which was especially divisive and furious, Samuel said that he couldn't do that and that he would only vote and cast both his votes for the Tory candidates. And the Whigs were absolutely appalled by this, and some of them who'd lent him money deliberately called it back in so that he would be forced to default and would therefore be imprisoned for debt. And of course, he was sent to the debtors' jail in Lincoln for 3 months. He was only released from the debtors' jail when his friends at the University of Oxford raised quite a large sum, I think it was over £100, to buy him out of jail. But it had been a pretty chastening experience, as you can imagine, and Susanna had been forced to fall back on the charity of local clergy and also the Archbishop of York. Now, Samuel's release from jail coincided with the death of his old friend James Gardner, the Bishop of Lincoln, and the appointment of this man, William Wake, as Bishop of Lincoln. William Wake was a rising star of the Whigs, and Wake's sympathy for dissenters was very strong, and he was appalled at the way Wesley had treated them. He didn't like the idea of prosecuting dissenters. And for 5 years, Samuel Wesley and William Wake seemed to have duelled over the issue of how to best run Epworth parish. Samuel did this by writing a series of letters, and it's worth saying that Samuel was incapable of writing a short letter. His letters almost always run to 8 or 9 pages of, it has to be said, very small handwriting. And he would write these very detailed letters asking Bishop Wake what he should do. But I think these letters, as I say, were traps. He was really saying to Bishop Wake, this is the reality of living in a parish. What do I do about this? And let me give you some examples. He gave Bishop Wake the case of one parent who was an excommunicated dissenter, and the other parent came to church. What should he do about that? Should he admit the other parent to church? What should he do about their children? He asked whether he should pursue dissenters who hadn't been formally married in church but had gone through some informal marriage service in their own chapel, even though that wasn't lawful. What should he do about dissenters who wouldn't pay their tithes? Should he try to catechize the children of dissenters? All of these cases were put to Wake, and I think Wesley was trying to get Wake to say either, yes, don't pursue the dissenters, or yes, pursue the dissenters. He was trying to get Wake to go for one or the other. But it's clear to me that Wake was pretty clever in dealing with Wesley very gingerly and not committing himself, and really saying to Wesley, well, you must decide what is the best to do in these circumstances. And it's pretty clear that Samuel Wesley became very dissatisfied with William Wake as Bishop of Lincoln. Now, by 1709, there were strong feelings between Tory clergy such as Samuel Wesley and Whig bishops like William Wake. And this reached boiling point at a sermon given by this man, Henry Sacheverell, in November 1709 in St. Paul's Cathedral. Because Henry Sacheverell, who was a pretty splenetic firebrand preacher, denounced Whig bishops as false brethren. He said they were the enemy within the church. And his sermon was a deeply shocking and sensational event. If you'd been in London in 1709, you would have heard the name Henry Sacheverell on everybody's lips. He was momentarily both a celebrity and a demon, depending on your point of view. Because Sacheverell had also attacked the government as betraying the church, he was put on trial in the House of Lords on a charge of sedition. Now, 60 years later, John Wesley wrote of his father that Samuel had told him that he had written Henry Sacheverell's defense speech. That's a remarkable claim. We know that Henry Sacheverell's defense speech was not written by Sacheverell himself, because everybody knew it was much too moderate and it wasn't sufficiently inflamed and splenetic for it to have been written by Sacheverell. But previously, people have thought, well, it was probably written by some lawyers. But here is John Wesley saying, no, my father wrote it. Samuel Wesley and Sacheverell had a lot in common. They both were contemptuous of dissenters. They both had a remarkable devotion to Charles I. Samuel wrote lots of poetry, and I've yet to come across a poem where Samuel Wesley didn't drag Charles I into it and say what a wonderful king he'd been. Now, in spite of the fact that Sacheverell was found guilty of sedition, he was only punished very lightly. He was given a sort of a rap over the knuckles, told he couldn't preach for 3 years, and otherwise let off. And Sir Chevreul rather perversely treated this as a great victory and began a nationwide tour in which all his followers and supporters mobbed him and said what a great chap he was. And there was huge celebration as if Sir Chevreul had beaten the court case. In the wake of Sir Chevreul's tour, the Tories won a landslide victory in Parliament, and there was also a Tory landslide in the elections to Convocation. Samuel Wesley was chosen as the representative of the clergy of Lincoln Diocese to go to Convocation. Bishop Wake had tried absolutely desperately to mobilize votes against Wesley, but he had failed. In Convocation, between 1710 and 1714, Samuel Wesley was appointed to key committees and was picked to write the report. I think, oh no, sorry, I haven't got the report. I thought I had the report, but I don't have it as a slide. He was picked to write the report of 1713, which described the proceedings of Convocation that year. And in it, Samuel Wesley said the reason why Convocation hasn't made such progress or any progress is because the Whig bishops have obstructed our business. Every time we tried to do something, the Whigs either vetoed it in the House of Bishops or they took things so slowly that we weren't able to get anything changed. Samuel Wesley's role in Convocation was a high point of his part in national politics. And really, it was an attempt to roll back the tide or the clock before the Toleration Act and the Revolution of 1689. But of course, by 1714, Queen Anne was ailing and she died in August 1714. And that brought George I to the throne and the Whigs to power. And for the next 40 years, Whigs formed the government. And perhaps the icing on the cake from the point of view of the Whigs, William Wake was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. I've often wondered what Samuel Wesley's thoughts were when he heard that Samuel Wake had been promoted to be Archbishop of Canterbury. When he returned to Epworth, Samuel Wesley sensed that he was surrounded by problems. And these were political problems. The Northern Lights had been seen in England as far south as London in 1710. And they were thought popularly to be a sign of divine displeasure at the Jacobite rebellion. Some Jacobites nicknamed them Lord Derwentwater's lights because they first appeared on the day when Lord Derwentwater was executed. So, of course, you paid your money and took your choice. Either they were divine indicator that the rebels were wrong, or they were divine indication that executing the rebels was wrong. About the same time, Samuel discovered that there were witches active in his parish, and he preached a sermon to his parishioners warning them not to have anything to do with witchcraft. But worse still, of course, his rectory was haunted by a ghost or poltergeist, Old Geoffrey, as it was nicknamed. And of course, this is the house still there today that Old Geoffrey appeared in. I should say that Old Geoffrey is the name given to the ghost because Old Geoffrey had been an old man who had come to the rectory, really, I think, to die, and he'd been put up by the family and had died shortly afterwards. So the family nicknamed the ghost Old Geoffrey. And Old Geoffrey rapped on headboards, he rattled the doors, he knocked on furniture, he appeared on occasion to press family members up against doors, and he appeared in the form of small animals in various rooms. These animals were described as a little bit like a badger. Now, the Epworth Rectory ghost is often referred to as one of the best documented hauntings in British history. And the reason for this is that John Wesley and his older brother Samuel Jr. were away at school in London, and they wrote to their parents and their brother and sisters saying, tell us what's going on. What you know, we've heard about the ghost, describe what's happening. And so there are more than a dozen letters between each of the parents and each of their brothers and sisters telling them what was happening from day to day. Besides the family, of course, their servants and their parishioners and even a neighbouring parson, Mr. Hoole of Haxey, witnessed the ghost and the knockings. And it seems curious to me that the family were very relaxed about old Geoffrey. The neighbours and indeed the family dog were terrified by old Geoffrey. But Samuel and Susanna and their children actually seem to have been quite relaxed about it. After a bit, Samuel and Susanna decided they would ask the ghost questions. They asked the ghost if it was one of the spirits of their dead or stillborn children, or if it had a message for them. But it didn't seem to have any message. Samuel did, however, discover that old Geoffrey was a Jacobite, like Susanna, because he played, he tested it. He, on one occasion, read family prayers and prayed for the new king, George I. And when he did this, the table knocked violently. And then on a later occasion at family prayers, he left off or omitted the prayers for the king, and old Geoffrey stayed silent. So it seems as if old Geoffrey was a Jacobite. After 3 months, old Geoffrey fell silent. And I have to say there are almost as many explanations for what was happening as there are people who studied the events. John Wesley, writing 50 years later in the Arminian magazine, concluded that old Geoffrey was a divine manifestation of displeasure, that Samuel had sworn not to go back and live with Susanna whilst she held Jacobite views, but Susanna had in fact retained her Jacobite views. Others, including a later rector of Epworth, J.H. Overton, claimed that it was a hoax. Overton had a very, very elaborate explanation for old Geoffrey, including that family members had winched up some machinery into the roof space of the rectory, and that it was this machinery that was making the rattling noise. Early in the 20th century, the spiritualist movement embraced the Epworth rectory as an example of spiritualism, and indeed in their written account of it said that they thought John Wesley, if he'd been alive in 1917, would have been a spiritualist. For the last decade and a half of Samuel Wesley's life, things were a little bit quieter. Of course, he faced the shock of his unmarried daughter's pregnancy with equanimity, and he never knew that his wife recorded in her diary her regret in her choice of husband. He remained desperately incompetent with money. He lost a fortune in diamonds that his brother-in-law had sent home from India. And towards the end of his life, in a rather poignant way actually, he admitted to his curate that he'd not been a success as a parish priest, and in fact told his curate not to make the same mistakes that he had done. He said he'd been too hard on his parishioners and had never found a way to get alongside them and befriend them. He'd been too judgmental and censorious. And he said rather sadly, not to use him as a model of how to be a parish priest. But on the death of his father in 1735, Samuel Jr. published a poem representing his father as a model parson, the embodiment of kindness and charity. He invented all sorts of myths about Samuel. For example, he said that his father had opposed James II, that he'd been friends with dissenters, and that he was more the victim of his troubles than the author of them. I have to say, I think that's a comforting fiction, but a fiction nevertheless. Despite the fact that all three of his sons were ordained, none became a parish clergyman, which might be significant. In John Wesley, I think you can see much of Samuel: his Toryism, his strong commitment to the church, his firmness to the political settlement of 1689 and 1714, his energy and his determination, perhaps his difficult relations with women, and certainly his absolute belief in the supernatural and divine intervention in the world. In Charles and Samuel, there's his love of poetry and of literature. And it's undoubtedly the case that all three sons revered their father as much as they did their mother. So while Susanna has been credited with the emotional and mental environment that gave rise to Methodism, Samuel was in many respects as strong, if not a stronger influence. Now, I shouldn't finish before I mention this picture, a newly discovered portrait of Samuel Wesley, which appears on the cover of my book. And it was tracked down by my colleague Peter Forsyth, who knew that it had been offered for sale by Christie's in the 1960s. But just before the auction, it had been withdrawn from the sale and disappeared. Christie's has a 50-year rule, so it won't reveal the ownership or the purchaser of an item until 50 years has elapsed from the sale. So 50 years after that sale in the 1960s, Peter tracked down the auction catalogue and the details of it, and it was revealed that this portrait is in fact at Rotham Park in Hertfordshire, the home of the Byng family. And there it is on the wall. It's a little bit grubby, and actually it's also alongside the portrait I showed earlier on of John Wesley, Samuel's father. So for the first time, we can get a true portrait of Samuel Wesley, and I hope I've today given you a little sense of what the man himself was like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was fascinating. What an insight into 18th century church politics, and that was really, really interesting. So thank you. We do have some time for questions, and one came up quite early on in your talk, so I'll bring that up now. And it related to the comment about Susanna's non-book Presbyterian baptism. So the question is, wasn't Samuel himself also a recipient of Presbyterian baptism?
Donna, that's a great question, and it's a real conundrum. I don't think he can have been baptized as a Presbyterian because he was so vehement that it was wrong for Susanna to have been baptized as a Presbyterian and not to have accepted subsequent baptism. I think he was probably baptized by his grandfather, Bartholomew Wesley, who was episcopally baptized. So I suspect that he was episcopally baptized by his grandfather. We are pretty certain that his father, we don't know this for certain, but we're pretty certain that John Wesley, Samuel's father, hadn't been episcopally ordained. He was very evasive when Bishop Ironsides of Bristol questioned him in 1661, and he was so evasive and used the formulas that Puritans tended to use, that he had been called to ministry rather than having been ordained, that it looked pretty certain that John Wesley had been ordained as a Presbyterian rather than by a bishop. But his grandfather had been ordained as a bishop, so my speculation is he was baptized by his grandfather.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when he made that remark about Susanna, is it not the case that there would have been other unbaptized members of the community? Like, for example, there were Quakers active in Epworth, weren't there?
Yes.
And they would not have been baptized unless, of course, they were older, you know, and had been born before. But so
I agree.
really pointed. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's quite clear that there were Anabaptists and Quakers in the parish who weren't baptized. What Samuel is actually doing is he's throwing Susanna under the bus, but he's throwing Susanna under the bus in front of Bishop Wake. And Bishop Wake was one of the bishops who had proclaimed that lay baptism was valid. Now, Samuel's view was that dissenting ministers were just ordinary laymen. They hadn't official orders or anything in his view. And therefore, Bishop Wake was saying that lay baptism, therefore dissenting baptism, was valid. So by writing that his wife had only got Presbyterian baptism, he's kind of, you know, putting two fingers up both to his wife and to his bishop. You know, with one blow, he's able to land a punch on both his wife and on his bishop. So yes, I think there's an animus there which lies behind that comment, really.
Yeah. Donna's just replied with, we see the zeal of the convert in Samuel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It seems incredible to me that Samuel had gone through dissenting academies. He'd witnessed his father repeatedly imprisoned for being a dissenter. But when he becomes an Anglican, he becomes absolutely a high church, Tory Anglican, about as high church as you could get. So yes, he has absolutely the zeal of the convert. And for him, therefore, dissenters were terrible sinners, which is really to demonize your father in that way.
Interesting, yeah. And I have a question about John Wesley, not John Wesley, John Wesley.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that all Samuel's sons spoke favourably of him. Could you say a little bit more about John's views of his father and how, what picture we get from John himself about his father?
Well, John, like Samuel Jr., depicts his father as a faithful parish priest. He doesn't say much about his father's character, but he does talk about how energetic working his father was, and he talks about him as a parish priest who was very painstaking. Now, you know, painstaking is the flip side of inflexible, isn't it, really? You know, it's almost an irregular verb, you know, I'm painstaking, you're inflexible.
Yeah.
I think genuinely John Wesley revered his father. Samuel had done things for John, including getting him into Oxford. And actually Samuel had used quite a lot of his credit to get John into Oxford. So I think John had a reverence for his father. And certainly in his writings, there's no negative stuff about Samuel at all, in spite of the fact that, you know, there was some negative stuff to be written about Samuel.
Well, we have another question. Do we have any public comments of Samuel about Bishop Gilbert Burnet and his views on pastoral ministry?
Tim, that's a brilliant question. And you said that Bishop Burnet had lent Samuel some money. Bishop Burnet was a Whig low churchman. He was a latitudinarian, and he believed, like Bishop Wake, in accommodating dissenters as much as possible. So the relationship between Samuel Wesley and Bishop Burnet is a bit curious. Why would a low church Whig lend quite a lot of money to a high church Tory? And the suspicion is that Burnet was lending Samuel money in the hope that he could inveigle him into being less of a stickler of a high churchman. Bishop Burnet published a manual called The Discourse of Pastoral Care in the 1690s, which became really the bestseller. In fact, it was being used in theological colleges in the Church of England right up into the 19th century. It was seen as the gold standard of how to manage a parish and how to discharge your duty as a parish priest. But it had some unfortunate things in it. So, for example, Bishop Burnet said the way to beat dissenters was to outpreach them and do better than them. In other words, he was saying, we've got to compete with dissenters. That wasn't Samuel Wesley's model at all. Samuel Wesley's model was there's a single national church and dissenters ought to be forced to come to it. So Samuel Wesley and Bishop Burnet have two different models of pastoral care. One is not a punitive one, but it's a model of a single national church that everybody must join. Whereas Burnet's view was, it doesn't matter if there's more than one church, let's get them in by being better than the rest. You know, the sort of John West Salmon approach to parish ministry.
So thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, about these support, like the unlikely supporters, or at least the more positive relationships that he seems to have enjoyed with Burnet. I get the impression then that he did have friends and supporters as well as those enemies.
Yes.
And there was a question about who he borrowed money from. Was Burnet the only money lender, or were there others?
Well, Burnet was a big money lender. He borrowed money also from a very great friend of his, Archbishop Sharp, who was the Archbishop of York, John Sharp. And he also, although he didn't borrow money from him, he took lots of advice and counsel from James Gardiner, who was the Bishop of Lincoln before William Wake. And in fact, James Gardiner had tipped off Samuel Wesley. Gardiner, I should say, had also earlier in his career been a rector of Epworth. So he knew what Samuel Wesley was going through. And he tipped Samuel Wesley off that there was a terrier, which is a church document listing all of the church lands. He tipped off Samuel Wesley that there was a terrier which suggested that people had carved up the church lands, and that actually Samuel Wesley was entitled to more than he had. So James Gardiner was very helpful to Samuel Wesley. So yes, there's no doubt that Samuel Wesley had friends. He wasn't a man who was incapable of friendship. And certainly his friends were very generous. Another very important benefactor was Henry Hoare, the founder of Hoare's Bank in London. And he gave very large sums of money to help Samuel Wesley get out of jail, and all of Samuel Wesley's friends in Oxford, who wrote very admiringly of him. One archdeacon wrote that he was one of the best clergymen in the north of England. So, you know, he had friends who regarded his Tory politics as a good thing.
Thanks. Yeah. One other question. How can we be sure that Samuel, and presumably Susanna, coped reasonably easily with Hetty's unexpected pregnancy? Would this not be quite scandalous?
That's a very good question. We know that Samuel coped pretty well with it, because there's no doubt that both Susanna and Hetty herself were very, very anxious about telling their father, or her father. And indeed, at one point, I think I'm right in saying, Susanna says to Hetty, "Let's not tell your father, let's keep him in ignorance of it." But actually, once they had told Samuel, he allowed her to come back into the house, and he doesn't seem to have demonized her and treated her in a very negative way. So the basis on which we can say that he coped with this with some degree of equanimity was the anxiety before, and the fact that actually there weren't the usual, or what might be expected to be, you know, a splenetic response from Samuel. Certainly Susanna doesn't record any negative comments from Samuel about their daughter. Clearly it was a scandalous matter. But I think Samuel seems to have been pretty indulgent about his children, in a funny kind of way. In fact, rather more indulgent, I think, than Susanna. You know, Susanna, I think, was the family disciplinarian. Those people who were at the Lincoln conference a few years ago heard the account at which Susanna said to her daughters, you know, "When I thrash you, you're expected to accept the thrashing with obedience and with silence." So Susanna could be quite a disciplinarian, and I think Samuel was actually a little bit more indulgent.
Well, I think we're getting towards the end of our time now, but I think just one last question about Samuel as a father. I mean, you said he writes towards the end of his life that he didn't feel he'd been a successful parish priest. Did he ever comment on his own parenting, on his own skills as a father? Did he ever make any comment about that?
I've not come across one, no. I think he was very, very proud of his sons. There were accounts of Samuel writing to the Dean of Christ Church about Samuel Jr. very admiringly, and talking about how bright and able his son was. And on occasion he visited Oxford when both Samuel Jr. and John were there, and I think he had a sense that the fact that all three of his sons went to Oxford was a great thing. Whether he had a similar view of his daughters, I suspect not. I think in those days, the sons were everything and the daughters, well, you know, they just got on with it really. So I suspect there was a degree of sexism and misogyny in Sam's approach, but I think he was proud of his sons. But the truth of it is, I don't think there's any writing in which Samuel says that. That's a historian's inference, rather.
Oh, that's great. That's really interesting. Thank you. Well, I think we're at the end of our time now. So, Gillian, would you like to say some final thank yous for us before we go?
I would, yes. I hope I'm not muted and everybody can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
I think your talk, Bill, does put a very different light on Samuel, and it'll be interesting to see, because several of my guides are part of the audience today, and I'm very keen to have a conversation with them about how we reinterpret Samuel, because he doesn't get a good press at Epworth Old Rectory. You know, we're all sort of sisters of Susanna, and he's a bit of a liability and a bit of a hard work and a bit of a monster. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what we do with this information out the other side of this. So I will catch up with the Keiths and Guy and various others after this, after we sort of have finished. Yeah, I will go back and read your book with more vigour, because I have a renewed enthusiasm for Samuel. I have to admit, his personality always sort of put me off, and I found him quite hard work. So I'm going to go back and enjoy Samuel for Samuel's sake.
Good.
So that's my news. We usually finish our session by asking the speaker to give us a blessing before we go, and Bill has agreed to do that for us. If I hand back to you, Bill.
Great, thank you, Jill. And I'm going to use a blessing which would have been familiar to Samuel, which is a very traditional Anglican blessing, which I think Methodists use as well. So may the blessing of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill.
And thank you. And could I just ask, Bill, where would people obtain a copy of the book?
Well, I'm afraid it's one of those academic books which sells at a horribly inflated price. I think the OUP cover price is £75, so not even I as the author would recommend you go and buy it. But I'm told that the OUP has an arrangement with interlibrary loan and with local public libraries, so that might be the best place that you can obtain a copy to borrow. And I suppose Gillian might be prepared to lend out the Epworth Rectory copy to those people who would leave a deposit and be trustees, so to speak.
I think I will be held to account, Bill.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I'll now close the recording and wish you all a very happy rest of your day. And thank you again, Bill, for a wonderful, fascinating talk. And
it's a great pleasure. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
And goodbye, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.